Hello and welcome to a Talmud Israeli production. Today we will review the highlights of this week's course of Daf Yomi study, Masechet Shabbat, pages 156 and 157, followed by Eruvin, pages 2 through 6. Kuf Nun Vav, 156 in Shabbat. Rabbi Chanina Omer, Mazal Machkim, Mazal Ma'ashir, V'yesh Mazal Yisrael. So according to Rabbi Chanina, a person's astrological sign can result in them being smarter, or it can result in them being wealthier. And in fact, the Jewish people, Yisrael, are largely influenced by our mazal. By contrast, Rabbi Yochanan said, Ein mazal leYisrael. The Jewish people are not affected by astrological sign. The Gemara then goes on to cite several accounts, several stories, where the proof seems to be that there is no mazal for Yisrael. Ein mazal leYisrael. Despite that fact, despite the Talmudic consensus, we nonetheless sing Siman Tovu Mazel Tov Yehilanu L'Chol Yisrael whenever we have a party or a festive occasion. But we shouldn't read into the singing of that song any theological conclusions, but rather it could just be a popular song despite the fact that the Talmud comes to the other conclusion. Kuf Nun Zayin, 157. The Mishnah says, Mefirin Nidarim L'Tzorach Shabbat. You're allowed to annul vows for the sake of the Sabbath. Now, when we say annul vows, we are referring to a father annulling his daughter's vow or a husband annulling his wife's vow. We are not referring to hatarat nedarim, the release of vows that any person can do by appealing to a chacham or to a court of three. Now, if we say that you're allowed to annul vows for the sake of the Shabbat, it must mean that Darim me'et la'et, that a husband or a father actually has 24 hours to annul his daughter or wife's vow, and that in case this was a vow that had no bearing on Sabbath observance, nonetheless there will be time after Havdalah to take care of those sorts of vows. And therefore we do not allow the father or husband to annul them on Shabbat when it's unnecessary, since he has time later. O Dilma, alternatively, another view, maybe he can annul vows even that are unrelated to, have no bearing on Sabbath observance. And if that were true, it must be the case that hafarat nedarim, annulment of vows, only can be done on that self-same day, but that as soon as nightfall hits, then he no longer has any opportunity to annul vows, which would mean that irrespective of whether the vow has anything to do with the Shabbos observance, we must let him annul the vow before darkness. Mazel Tov, we've concluded Masechet Shabbat. Now Eruvin. Daf Bet, page 2. Ma'avoy shehu gavoa l'mala me'esrim ama pesula. The Mishnah says that if a ma'avoy was higher than 20 cubits, 20 amma, it is invalid. But this Mishnah is using imprecise language, because in fact the ma'avoy is the alleyway that leads to multiple courtyards, chatserot. Actually, what we're addressing is the korah, the crossbeam that encloses the open fourth side of the mavui. And yet, despite the fact that we're addressing the korah and not the mavui in its entirety, the Mishnah uses the language of mavui in referencing the crossbeam. Gimel, page 3. Amar Abaye, Mishmei Rav Nachman, Amat Sukkah, v'amat mavui ba'ama bat chamisha, amat klaim ba'ama bat shisha. There is a question as to how long an amma actually is, a cubit. By conventional wisdom, it is the distance from a person's tip of the elbow to the tip of their finger. However, it is also measured by tfachim, by hand breadths, by fist lengths. Whether it's 5 tfachim or 6 tfachim is a debate in the Gemara. What Rav Nachman is saying is that for certain halachic purposes, we will use the 5 tfachim amma, and for other halachic purposes, we will use the 6 tfachim amma, depending upon what results in greater stringency. So in the case of sukkah, we'll use the smaller amma, meaning that you're not allowed to have a sukkah that is higher than 20 amot, and those 20 amot are going to be 100 tfachim, 20 times 5, not 120 tfachim, which would have been 20 times 6. Similarly, with a mavui, you're allowed to have a korah as high as 20 amot, which will be 100 tfachim and not 120 tfachim. However, when it comes to klaim, forbidden admixtures of species in a garden, whether vineyard with other types of produce or just a general admixture of species, we want to have maximum distance between the various species, so as to not have crossbreeding. So in this instance, we'll use a 6 tefach amah because we want to maximize the required distance between the various rows. Daled. Amar Rav, Shun halacha Moshe Sinai. Measurements, shiurim. The measurements for various halachic purposes are known to us through halacha Moshe Sinai, the law of Moses on Sinai, meaning it is not found in the text of the Torah and cannot even be derived from the text of the Torah, but is known exclusively from the oral law, from the oral tradition, dating back to Moshe Rabbeinu. To this, the Gemara responds, but wait a minute. Shirim do'oraitahu, dichtiv, eretz chitao sora. Actually, no, there is a biblical citation used to justify the various shiurim. It's a famous pasuk of eretz chitao sora, the verse in Torah that mentions the 7 fruits of Eretz Yisrael. To this, the Gemara responds, v'tizba shir mechtav tivi, but if you really read that verse, it doesn't actually say anything about shiurim. It just lists a bunch of fruit of Eretz Yisrael. So rather, hilchatanin, who the true origin of these laws is halacha Moshe Sinai, hilchata. Okay, and the rabbis simply found a scriptural hook, a scriptural allusion, an asmachta, with which to pin these halachot onto a Bible text. But that really at core, they are halacha Moshe Sinai. Page 5, hey. Lechi habolet midafno shel mavui. If a lechi means a side post, and a lechi is used to rectify the open side of a mavui. If it extends, it protrudes out of the wall of the building a distance of 4 cubits, nidon or less, 4 or less, then nidon mishum lechi. It can be identified as a lechi, as a side post, and can function to halachically enclose the open 4th side of the mavui. Ve'en tzarich lechi achar da'ati. You would not need another lechi to solve your problem. Dal amot, but if it's 4 amot and more, nidon mishum mavui, then it's not considered a lechi, it's just considered the wall of the mavui, the wall of the building. But tzarich lechi achar lahatiro, you would require another side post to rectify the problem of the open side. Daf Vav, page 6. Yerushalayim, the city of Jerusalem, was it an enclosed area or was it an unenclosed area? Could you carry in it on Shabbos or not? Ilmalei dal toten or alot balayla, had it not been for the fact that the city doors and its gates are closed at night, had it not been true, then you would have been liable for carrying the public domain in the city of Jerusalem. But because the city doors were closed at night, that took away the status of a full-fledged Reshut HaRabim, and therefore there was no biblical liability for carrying in Yerushalayim. As Rashi explains, Reshut HaRabim, Shelah, its public thoroughfare in Jerusalem, Mechuvan l'shar l'shar, was a straight line from one gate to another, mefulash, with no impediments, one gate to the other, straight shot. The yesh bad risat shishim ribo, and 600,000 people which traversed the streets daily, or could traverse it daily, so it had sufficient foot traffic. V'rachav sheishes ve'ama, and it was 16 cubits wide. So all the various elements that go into making up a biblical Reshut HaRabim were present in the city of Jerusalem. And if it weren't for the fact that they sealed the doors every night, there would have been biblical liability for carrying. However, aval, since they do close the doors at night, it effectively becomes a chatzer shel rabim, a public courtyard, and you can perform an eruv chatzerot, a commingling of everyone's rights by means of a supply of food. And if there was no Eruv Chatzerut done, it would simply be a karmelit. And in a karmelit, there is no biblical liability for carrying. Everyone have a great week.